Welcome to the History Nerds Not Podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Kate Summerscale, The Peepshow, historical true crime, English serial killer. If you're English, you probably heard of Reg Christie. If you're American, you may not have heard about him. I don't want to give too much away. The story is absolutely insane. Kate does a wonderful job with the book. It was so nice to talk to her, so how about I shut up and stop talking, and let's talk to Kate. And here we are with author Kate Summerscale, The Peepshow, The Murders at Rillington Place. Kate, thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure. I'm very happy to be here.
The Reg Christie story, I don't know how familiar U.S. audiences are with him, but in the U.K., this is a pretty famous story, right? Is he kind of, I guess for the U.S., like Ted Bundy, everybody knows who Ted Bundy was. In the UK, is Reg Christie kind of that famous, like everyone knows the basics of this story?
He was that famous. To a sort of slightly older generation, he's certainly that famous. It was probably the most notorious crime of the 1950s. And his wax statue is still in the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds. So many people like me, he's almost a sort of mythological figure. We don't quite know what he did, but something horrible. His name is vaguely familiar, and certainly the name of his house where he committed his crimes, 10 Rillington Place, is probably the most notorious crime scene in British history.
So now, Reg Christie is a serial killer. I think it's important right off the bat. Who is Tim Evans, and how is he related to Reg Christie?
Reg Christie's crimes were uncovered in 1953. The police found the remains of 6 women in his house under the floorboards behind a wall in the garden. And the penny dropped for some observers, some journalists, that another man had been hanged for committing a double murder in the exact same property 3 years earlier. This man, Tim Evans, was convicted of killing his baby daughter. He had also apparently killed his wife. But in the course of the investigation, he had blamed Christie. And this had been dismissed at the time because Christie, his downstairs neighbour, seemed such a respectable figure in the neighbourhood. But now that he'd been exposed as a serial killer, it seemed very possible that Tim Evans had been hanged in error and Christie had been responsible for that double murder as well.
And it seems like, especially around this time, you know, when you're coming at this story, as you said, people know he's kind of mythological. When you start this book, are you looking at this and saying, there's a piece missing that I want to bring to this story? Or do you want to bring more pieces together and kind of show a more fuller story? What's your angle for this when you start to write this book?
I was prompted, I think, by the murders of some women by strangers in London in the last few years, and starting to wonder why some men killed women essentially because they were women, not because they had a personal animus against them. And Reg Christie seemed an emblematic figure in this history, the recent history. When I wanted to find out not only what motivated him in his personal history, but also the social history, how these women fell into his clutches, who they were, how women like them were represented at the time, and how that may have fed into and shaped his fantasies. So I wanted to find the connections between the personal. So I wanted to write a work of social history that was also a true crime investigation.
And it seems another aspect of this that is kind of huge is the state of newspapers and how they're telling stories around this time. Can you talk a little bit about what are newspapers like? What are they focusing on? How does this story kind of catch fire, so to speak?
There was a huge boom in Fleet Street in the newspaper business at this time. There were more British newspaper readers than anywhere else in the world. And journalism was incredibly lucrative. The journalists often ferried their informants around in Rolls Royce or went to crime scenes in helicopters. And they were fiercely competitive, especially among the tabloids in Fleet Street. And so everyone was chasing the scoops and getting up to all manner of devious, borderline illegal activity in order to get the stories before their rivals. So it was a very racy, murky world. And in this case, one newspaper man in particular got very tangled up in the Rillington Place story.
This was Harry Proctor, right? You introduce him very early on about how he kind of gets pulled in. Who is he? What is he like? I have some thoughts, especially with the way you present him. I absolutely loved it. But who is he? Is he a great journalist? What's his deal?
He was a star crime reporter in Fleet Street. He was a working class boy from the north of England who'd risen to the heights of journalism, worked for a tabloid newspaper, the Sunday Pictorial, and took great pride in always getting to a story first and giving it a lot of human colour. Harry Proctor had been to 10 Rillington Place when the double murder of Beryl and Geraldine Evans was committed in 1949, and he had interviewed Christie about it. And he had taken Christie entirely at face value, believed him to be respectable, educated gentleman, and had not suspected for a second that he was responsible for the murders. So when he went to the crime scene in 1953 and realized that Christie had killed 6 women on his premises, he was horrified by his own mistake and the fact that in effect he left Christie free to carry on killing by failing to suspect him. And he wanted to atone for this. He wanted to correct his error. He also wanted a scoop for his newspaper and to confirm his reputation as this demon terrier of a journalist. So he went after the Christie story fiercely, and he did manage to secure the exclusive. In return, Christie would write his life story for him from prison, he promised, in return for the Sunday Pictorial paying for his defence at the Old Bailey. This was a secret arrangement, not strictly above board. And so Harry Proctor was at once trying to get Christie to make a confession to the double murder of 1949, but also he was helping him. He was helping his defence. So it was a very morally compromised situation.
And I love the way you kind of introduce Harry in the book, because the first few pages are like, all right, you're going to introduce the newspaper man. This is a good way to kind of add some color and everything. But the first few pages, I remember thinking, ooh, I don't know if I like Harry or not. As you were saying, like there is so much gray that goes throughout the book. And I like when I feel like you get to know a full character, that there isn't just a hero or a villain. Was that kind of your intention with Harry from the jump, that you kind of don't know what's really driving him? Is it that scoop? Is it fixing something he think he missed before? Is that kind of what you were going for?
Yeah, that's what I felt about him. So I'm glad if that translated to the page. I felt some sort of horror at the schemes and the deviousness he displayed. But I also felt sort of sorry for him, the situation he found himself in. And I felt some admiration for the absolute sort of gusto and determination with which he pursued a story. So lots of mixed feelings about him. And certainly he was driven in part by a need to sort of keep his head above water. He felt if he lost his job, that would be it. He'd be destitute. Because as a newspaper man, you're only as good as your last story. And if he failed completely, and he had a large family to support. So his kind of mixture of desperation, the fact he felt trapped by Fleet Street in the end, and it kind of broke him. After the Christie case, he begged his editors not to assign him to any more crime stories, and they refused because he was too good. So the trap that he found himself in, both with the Christie story supporting the man he loathed and wanted to expose, and in Fleet Street more generally, his very success meant that he could not afford to turn down any assignment and had to persevere.
Especially his story, it reminds me how truth is often more stranger than fiction, because a lot of the things that happen to him throughout the book as a journalist and what he has to do. If you wrote that into some fictional noir book, people would be like, you're going too far. People wouldn't do this in real life. And you read this and you're like, oh man, like nothing touches what really went on when they were going for a scoop and being pushed to constantly be, you got to be first. You got to get this. You got to get this. And it was just that constant going after it, even at the sacrifice of your soul a little bit.
Right. Yes. I think I'm often drawn to stories, true stories, that feel as if they're almost too large for fiction. They're almost too colourful or vivid or weird. They're at the sort of outer edges of what's believable. And in a way, Harry's story as a reporter is like that, as well as, more obviously, Christie's story as a serial killer, the manner and the horror of the way he carried out his crimes. It's sort of, it's kind of too much, there's an excess, and that is always intriguing. It's very appealing to try to translate that back into history, to sort of see how these outlandish, almost surreal events can grow out of a real place and time.
Somebody else I had never heard of before and gets introduced here is Fryn Tennyson Jessie. How does she factor in this story? What's her deal? How famous was she back in her day?
She had become pretty famous in the 20s and 30s as a true crime writer, sort of pioneer of the form, really. She wrote essays about the psychology of murderers and about individual crimes, historical and current. And she was also a novelist, very successful novelist. But by the 1950s, reputation was beginning to fade. She was sort of half forgotten. She was 65 years old. She was going blind. She was addicted to morphine. A doctor came and gave her injections every day. And she was desperate to cover the Christie case as a way of giving her some work to do, giving her a mission, a purpose, and restoring her reputation. She campaigned vigorously to get a seat at his trial at the Old Bailey, and then she went on to write a very influential 100-page essay about his case and that of Timothy Evans, and to try to establish which of the two men had killed Beryl and Geraldine Evans in 1849.
What I'm constantly confused about with this story is, and you mentioned it before, that when Proctor first came along the Evans case, Reg Christie seems like the stand-up, respectable guy. But as you learn more, Christie also seems like he was an absolute weirdo and just kind of ghoulish and strange. But it seemed like two completely different people lived in Reg Christie. Was it a case of people were seeing what they wanted to see, or was he like a lot of serial killers where he could be a chameleon for wherever he was and whoever he was talking to?
There's a kind of dissociation about him. In his very long statement that he prepared for Harry Proctor, he confesses to most of the crimes, almost casually. He says, "It must have been me." It's almost as if in his own mind there wasn't a dislocation between the highly moralistic, rather fastidious, disapproving man who the neighbours saw and the man who could gas, rape and strangle women he had lured to his house. In his own mind, these things seemed quite compatible. He'd sort of boast about how he didn't drink any spirits or go to pubs, or he didn't approve of prostitutes. It's very sort of chilling and eerie to read, to see that he could kind of own the crimes while also believing in himself as a morally upright figure. It's sort of weird disjunction looked at from the inside, but from his own perspective, these things were compatible. And that maybe tells you something about some weirdness in British society in the 1950s. He had almost Victorian attitudes that could extend to thinking it was sort of almost acceptable to murder young women who were of not of great value to society.
It really reminded me of Hallie Rubenhold's The Five, where you're talking about these victims, and basically the newspapers want to just be like, they must have been prostitutes. They got murdered at Reg Christie house. I guess they're just prostitutes. Was that just everywhere where kind of, this woman ended up in this situation, so clearly she was probably a sex worker? Was there just no fact checking? Was it just not worth it for the newspapers to care?
Well, one of the women was a sort of full-time sex worker. She had a drink problem. She slept in a public lavatory up near Paddington, but she was much loved by her friends, a very loyal and generous friend. The others were not. They worked as munitions workers in factories or as waitresses in cafes. One wanted to be a nurse. One wanted to be an artist. They were very various. But I suppose at the time, any young woman who was very short of money and living on the fringes of society in this very deprived part of West London might have traded sexual favours for money or for silk stockings or for a drink. These were pretty desperate lives. So to some extent, the category of sex worker is a bit blurry when you get to people who are this poor and women who were paid much less than men and were living really on the edge. And one of the few commodities they had, as it were their bodies. It was quite striking to read in the newspapers how they were described. They were seen as sort of lost girls, unfortunates, treated dismissively. Fryn, Tennyson, Jessie described them as murderees and as poor little tarts. And one of the pathologists who worked on the case described these kinds of women who got murdered as better off out of this world. So this sort of dehumanizing language, to my mind, linked up with the dehumanizing that Reg Christie carried out on them, that there was a sense in which they were types rather than individuals, representatives of something degraded in the country.
It's got to be wild reading old newspapers. You mentioned it in here, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you just came across one story where it was just talking about, I think, like fat Australians on vacation or something, where people just, even nowadays, we still have trash tabloids. Like, I understand that. But it's got to be kind of wild when you're sitting there with this very serious case and you're reading a newspaper, then you see, oh, they're talking about this today in just the most ridiculous way possible.
Yes, that was one of Harry Proctor's first stories, covering an Australian couple who were on honeymoon in London, who were fat, as described in the paper. That was the whole story. They sort of, that was it. And they sort of, photographer, reporter. I mean, there's some really ludicrous stuff. And I guess the papers then, even more than now, were vehicles of entertainment. Your comparison with reality TV or trash TV is apt, because they were like reality TV. The BBC was very staid at the time. There was BBC radio, there was television, though few people had televisions in their homes, but it was very sort of staid and respectable. And the tabloids did all the kind of crazy, experimental, intrusive, colourful flim-flam, And so they are like alternately shocking and amusing to read. They're absolutely packed with colour.
Well, speaking of ludicrous, crazy, unbelievable, I don't even know how to start talking about the various stories Reg Christie came up with for all of the dead women on his property. Was there anyone that stuck out to you? Because, I mean, again, he had changed his tune so many times, and it almost seems like he didn't know, or he was testing out like, oh, hey, let me see how upset people get if maybe they'll fall for this or anything. Especially as researching for a book, was it hard to keep up with all of his ideas about how these women died?
Yes, maybe that's part of the point. That was his last form of power and control, was altering his story, and he did it repeatedly. His first account was probably the most ludicrous, where he told the police that the women found in his premises, specifically the 3 who were discovered walled up in his kitchen. They were in an alcove which he had boarded over, papered over, and painted. He said each of them had followed him home and attacked him or refused to leave. So he presented them as his assailants. It just didn't add up in any way, either kind of psychologically, emotionally, or physically, that this was what had happened. And it seems like a straight case of kind of projection. He just said they did to him what he in fact did to them. And he depicted himself as a victim. He just reversed the lens and he was the victim. Similarly with his wife and Beryl Evans on the occasions that he admitted to killing her. In both cases, framed them as mercy killings, that these women wanted to die, that he was assisting them in suicide attempts. And I wondered if this in some way reflected his own despair and kind of bewilderment. I mean, I do think he probably didn't know quite why he did what he did, but it wasn't out of compassion and it wasn't because women attacked him. I can be fairly sure of that. So he is almost pulling stories out of the air. It was extremely confusing to keep track, not just of what he was saying at any given point or what was likely, but why he was saying these things, these frankly unbelievable things.
Then you add Tim Evans, which before he was executed for the crimes before these that we're talking about, even he was changing his story almost constantly, I should say. And I don't know that you can ever fully know exactly why either of them would keep telling these different stories, because it just made sure that no one was really going to believe anything they said when it came down to it.
Well, in King Christie's case, it was kind of in his interests that nobody believed anything he said, because his defence at the Old Bailey was to confess to the crimes, but to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. So the more kind of inconsistent he was, the better from his point of view. Tim Evans is a more mysterious thing. Tim Evans went missing at the same time as his wife and daughter in 1949, then handed himself into the police, saying that his wife had died accidentally, but at the hands of Reg Christie, while Reg Christie was giving her an illegal abortion. Then he changed that story and said that he had himself killed his wife and daughter. Then he changed again to say, no, it was Christie done it. He said this in the Old Bailey when he was being tried for the murder of his daughter Geraldine, and the jury didn't believe him, and he was convicted and hanged. So why did he change his story so many times? If he didn't do it, why did he confess? And if he did do it, why did it occur to him to blame his apparently respectable neighbour, who he apparently didn't know was also a serial killer and had already buried 2 women in the garden? It was absolutely mind-scrambling to try to tease out what was going on between these 2 men. And I did come across a document at the National Archives in the files on the cases. It was actually in the prison file on Christie, a memo by a prison guard in which Christie gave an account of those murders, a very brief account, which I came to believe explained the contradictions in Tim Evans' story. It implied that Tim Evans was more involved than not, but that Christie was the killer. And this document, I realised, had been actively suppressed by the British government in 1953. Was a statement that Christie made immediately after he was sentenced to death. So he felt, I think, that he had nothing to lose by telling the truth. But of course, we can never know. He told so many lies. To my mind, this story, which was not in his interest to tell, was the one that could explain the many confusions that had beset me for months and months about what on earth was going on with Timothy Evans. Why did he confess to his baby's murder? So yes, that was an exciting find, and it did feel like a kind of relief to find some explanation for all these contradictions.
Because it was just mind-boggling, all these different stories, and yet Reg Christie, for the most part, right, for the vast majority of times, he always kept away from saying that he killed the baby. And he almost seemed to be okay that he killed all of these women, but the baby, that was too far. And
right.
that was always so very strange, until, of course, you explain, right, he can kind of make up stuff about the women, but trying to explain the baby, it was never going to work. But there was that fine line of he needed to be crazy enough, and the more women he actually killed, bolstered that defense. But then if he also killed the baby, then all of a sudden he kind of wasn't insane and his defense falls apart. And it seems just so counterintuitive with all of these different things coming together.
I mean, I think in his own mind, he boasted when he was in prison about the women he'd killed. He seemed to look on the killings as sexual conquests. He was impotent, apparently, in his marriage and so on. Through violence, he seems to have attained a sense of power, of personal power. So obviously the baby doesn't fall in that category. I mean, it's very chilling about the period that this seemed to go unremarked upon, as if it was like, well, yeah, of course. It was as if killing a woman was a kind of sexual conquest. It was sort of half understood in those terms as a kind of extension of the desire to have sex with a woman, whereas a baby was a different category. And I suppose that Christie anticipated that the loathing that would come to him for having killed a child would put him beyond the pale, beyond the sort of sane categories and just evil, maybe. But for whatever reason, he steadfastly refused to he admitted to the killing of the mother, but not the child, until this moment that I read about in this memo when he said to the prison guard, yeah, I killed them both, and then explained why.
Listen, you are one of the queens of UK true crime. I'm going to say it. This is not your first rodeo with this book. It's brutal, though. How do you, as an author, kind of take care of yourself when you're reading such depressing, horrific stuff? Is it something like you set an alarm so that every hour of researching you go for a 10-minute walk or something? Because there's just sometimes no let up in books like this.
Yeah, well, I did do a lot of walking. I mean, the worst of it was reading Christie's extremely long statement and feeling like you were, trying to understand him and instead feeling just stifled by him, almost cudgeled by his sort of hollowness and banality. That was really tough. To me, I wasn't just in his company in researching and writing this book. I was in the company of Harry Proctor, Fryn, Tennyson, Jessie, the women who met Christie, both those who he killed and those who got away and afterwards were able to sort of report on him and describe his assaults or his methods. It was a very dark subject and setting in a way, post-war Britain, all the bomb-damaged streets, the deprivation, the racial tension, all these sort of conflicts that had arisen and left over from the war. But to me, it was a very lively human story in all its aspects. And I was just very fascinated by the lives of the people that I was dealing with.
Okay, I want you to pretend for a second that I am magic. I can send you back in time to talk to one person from this book that you couldn't talk to now. I'm going to take Reg off the table because he's lying scum anyway. So anybody else from the book, who would you love to get an hour interview with and just kind of pick their brain?
Tim Evans.
I think that would probably be mine too, because I really want to get, like, dude, what happened?
Yeah, and I'd want to put my theory to him. I want to put my hypothesis to him about how things unfolded, what he said, what he intended, what Christie said and did, how he felt afterwards, how he felt about his child's death, how he felt about his wife's death. I would hope that he might be able to speak truly about those things if he wasn't so set on covering up the details of what unfolded in that house, and if that was kind of out in the open. And I'd like to know how much he was a confused person and how much a pretty heartless one. All
right, getting away from this just for a second. It was kind of a palate cleanser before we finish up. I'm always interested, do you have time to read nonfiction yourself just for fun? And if you do, like, who are your go-to for authors? Or do you have friends who have books coming out you want to plug for them right now? Do you have any examples or anything?
Hallie Rubenhold, who you mentioned, she's a friend, and I've read her new book, which was tremendous.
It was. I got to interview her as well, led me to you. So.
Oh, did you? So I would recommend that. In the true crime field, I would really recommend also Helen Garner, an Australian author, who wrote a book called This House of Grief, which is about the trial of a man who was accused of killing his sons and who claimed that in fact they died. They died when his car went off the road into a reservoir, and he claimed it was an accident, and the prosecution claimed it was deliberate. And it's an extraordinary book. She charts all the shifts in her feelings about the case, and it's great. Off the true crime thing, I recently, maybe a bit late, read The Wager by David Gran, which is an incredible work of historical non-fiction, just an amazing, emotional adventure story that draws on the archives so beautifully and effectively and incidentally teaches you stuff. It's not, it's not a work that goes out of ways to educate as well as so gripping.
I love this book. And I know that there are some people out there, we call them poor misguided souls, who think that nonfiction is boring or, true crime just ends up being sad. You and I both know that those people are just, again, poor misguided souls. But if I sat one of them in front of you and they said, Kate, why should I read The Peepshow? What would you say?
It's a story about human beings. It's history because we need to learn about the world they lived in, their time, as well as their place, in order to understand them. It's all in the service of understanding the people and how they proceeded through the world, how they felt and thought, and what they experienced. And I hope that reading about people in the past, certainly for me, it's a way of thinking about the present. It's an oblique way of thinking about now, always. You just can't help it as a researcher, as a writer, as a reader. You're always taking your bearings from the past and seeing where you coincide, where the same dramas or conflicts are being played out, where you're different. So it's also about you and the world you live in now. And I think that reading things set in the past is actually much more fruitful in terms of thinking about now than reading about the present, where it's all a bit too close up to see the connections between the individuals and the social and cultural forces and the ideas around us. But with a bit of distance, those things start to come into focus.
Kate, couldn't agree more. I love the book. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.
And that's it for this episode. Kate, thank you so much. The Peepshow. Go out and get it, folks. Absolutely fantastic historical true crime. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.